Good morning, folks. I hope you've all had a brilliant week. It's certainly been a good one for news, and so I've been quite looking forward to presenting the news at Ben this morning, and thank you very much for tuning in. Now, I think there have been a couple of big news items this week, amongst no doubt many, but the two I want to look at, both of a foreign policy nature, relate to the United States of America. The first of which was JD Vance's brilliant speech in Munich. Now, we're getting used to hearing members of Trump's team speaking fearlessly about what needs to be done to secure Western civilization, to secure America's interests, and to make sure that the tide against democracy, free speech is pushed back. We're getting used to hearing that from a number of brave, fearless people in the Trump administration, not least of which is certain Elon Musk. But what we're not used to hearing, and certainly what we haven't until JD Vance's speech heard, was someone in that kind of position speaking so forthrightly about something that affects the entire constitutional political framework of Europe and the United Kingdom. And JD Vance's speech, therefore, in my view, is seismic, because what it reveals is the Trump's effectively official view of the state of European and British democracy. And the verdict is not a good one. And many of you listening, if not all of you listening, will totally understand that. You know, the battle that we've been having in the United Kingdom ever since 2016 to get out of the EU has effectively been one of democracy, a battle for democracy. The British people voted to leave the EU, and then we've had 9 years nearly now of the establishment frustrating it. We still haven't got Brexit. But without moving on to Brexit at this stage, let's just distill the two key things that let's distill down the two key things JD Vance said. The first was that there isn't freedom of speech in Europe, and that is something about which, again, I think everyone listening to me now will be very aware of.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within. The retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values shared with the United States of America. Now, I was struck that a former European commissioner went on television recently and sounded delighted that the Romanian government had just annulled an entire election. He warned that if things don't go to plan, the very same thing could happen in Germany too. Now, these cavalier statements are shocking to American ears. For years, we've been told that everything we fund and support is in the name of our shared democratic values. Everything from our Ukraine policy to digital censorship is billed as a defense of democracy. But when we see European courts canceling elections and senior officials threatening to cancel others, we ought to ask whether we're holding ourselves to an appropriately high standard. And I say ourselves because I fundamentally believe that we are on the same team. We must do more than talk about democratic values, we must live them. Now, within living memory of many of you in this room, the Cold War positioned defenders of democracy against much more tyrannical forces on this continent. And consider the side in that fight that censored dissidents, that closed churches, that canceled elections. Were they the good guys? Certainly not. And thank God they lost the Cold War. They lost because they neither valued nor respected all of the extraordinary blessings of liberty. The freedom to surprise, to make mistakes, to invent, to build. As it turns out, you can't mandate innovation or creativity, just as you can't force people what to think, what to feel, or what to believe. And we believe those things are certainly connected. And unfortunately, when I look at Europe today, it's sometimes not so clear what happened to some of the Cold War's winners. I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. Or to this very country, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of, quote, combating misogyny on the internet, a day of action. I look to Sweden, where 2 weeks ago the government convicted a Christian activist for participating in Koran burnings that resulted in his friend's murder. And as the judge in his case chillingly noted, Sweden's laws to supposedly protect free expression do not, in fact, grant, and I'm quoting, a free pass to do or say anything without risking offending the group that holds that belief. And perhaps most concerningly, I look to our very dear friends, the United Kingdom, where the backslide away from conscience rights has placed the basic liberties of religious Britons in particular in the crosshairs. A little over 2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes. Not obstructing anyone, not interacting with anyone, just silently praying on his own. And after British law enforcement spotted him and demanded to know what he was praying for, Adam replied simply, it was on behalf of the unborn son he and his former girlfriend had aborted years before. Now, the officers were not moved. Adam was found guilty of breaking the government's new buffer zones law, which criminalizes silent prayer and other actions that could influence a person's decision within 200 meters of an abortion facility. He was sentenced to pay thousands of pounds in legal costs to the prosecution. Now, I wish I could say that this was a fluke, a one-off crazy example of a badly written law being enacted against a single person. But no, this last October, just a few months ago, the Scottish government began distributing letters to citizens whose houses lay within so-called safe access zones, warning them that even private prayer within their own homes may amount to breaking the law. Naturally, the government urged readers to report any fellow citizens suspected guilty of thought crime. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat. And in the interest of comedy, my friends, but also in the interest of truth, I will admit that sometimes the loudest voices for censorship have come not from within Europe, but from within my own country, where the prior administration threatened and bullied social media companies to censor so-called misinformation. Misinformation like, for example, the idea that coronavirus had likely leaked from a laboratory in China. Our own government encouraged private companies to silence people who dared to utter what turned out to be an obvious truth. So I come here today not just with an observation, but with an offer. And just as the Biden administration seemed desperate to silence people for speaking their minds, so the Trump administration will do precisely the opposite. And I hope that we can work together on that.
With the emergence of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the requirement that we promote minority interests over and above and to the detriment, if necessary, of our own, comes a damping down of free speech. You can't silence the majority without silencing them through preventing them from being able to speak. And, you know, in a sense, that's why they're called a silent majority, because they haven't been heard. And so through DEI, the promotion of minority interests over and above and to the detriment of that of the majority, we have seen the shutting down of free speech. We have seen in our own land non-crime hate incidents for which you can read saying things which offend other people. And the police have arrested journalists on the back of that. They've even taken on to task 9-year-old boys. And so we are very well aware that what JD Vance said in his speech, that the example that he used for the United Kingdom was the silent prayer of an individual 50 meters away from an abortion clinic who was arrested literally not even for speaking, but for being there and for thinking things he wasn't allowed to think, essentially of an anti-abortion nature. So we know that what JD Vance said was absolutely right. And we also know that what he said about Europe is equally right. Their desire to stop Brexit was an absolute anti-democratic move. The European Union itself is anti-democratic. It stands against nation states' democracies. It concentrates power in itself. And we've seen all the same things that have unfolded in the UK unfold in Europe as well, along the lines that I've just been discussing. The second criticism that JD Vance made of Europe and the United Kingdom was unbridled immigration. He talked about how unbridled immigration had been allowed to take place across Europe and obviously in the UK without the consent of the people.
And of all the pressing challenges that the nations represented here face, I believe there is nothing more urgent than mass migration. Today, almost 1 in 5 people living in this country moved here from abroad. That is, of course, an all-time high. It's a similar number, by the way, in the United States, also an all-time high. The number of immigrants who entered the EU from non-EU countries doubled between 2021 and 2022 alone, and of course, it's gotten much higher since. And we know the situation, it didn't materialize in a vacuum. It's the result of a series of conscious decisions made by politicians all over the continent and others across the world over the span of a decade. We saw the horrors wrought by these decisions yesterday in this very city. And of course, I can't bring it up again without thinking about the terrible victims who had a beautiful winter day in Munich ruined. Our thoughts and prayers are with them and will remain with them. But why did this happen in the first place? It's a terrible story, but it's one we've heard way too many times in Europe and unfortunately too many times in the United States as well. An asylum seeker, often a young man in his mid-20s, already known to police, rams a car into a crowd and shatters a community. How many times must we suffer these appalling setbacks before we change course and take our shared civilization in a new direction? No voter on this continent went to the ballot box to open the floodgates to millions of unvetted immigrants. But you know what they did vote for? In England, they voted for Brexit, and agree or disagree, they voted for it. And more all over Europe, they're voting for political leaders who promise to put an end to out-of-control migration. Now, I happen to agree with a lot of these concerns, but you don't have to agree with me. I just think that people care about their homes, they care about their dreams, they care about their safety and their capacity to provide for themselves and their children. And they're smart. I think this is one of the most important things I've learned in my brief time in politics. Contrary to what you might hear a couple mountains over in Davos, the citizens of all of our nations don't generally think of themselves as educated animals or as interchangeable cogs of a global economy. And it's hardly surprising that they don't want to be shuffled about or relentlessly ignored by their leaders. And it is the business of democracy to adjudicate these big questions at the ballot box. I believe that dismissing people, dismissing their concerns, or worse yet, shutting down media, shutting down elections, or shutting people out of the political process protects nothing. In fact, it is the most surefire way to destroy democracy. And speaking up and expressing opinions isn't election interference. Even when people express views outside your own country, and even when those people are very influential. And trust me, I say this with all humor, if American democracy can survive 10 years of Greta Thunberg's scolding, you guys can survive a few months of Elon Musk. But what no democracy, American, German, or European, will survive is telling millions of voters that their thoughts and concerns, their aspirations, their pleas for relief are invalid or unworthy of even being considered. Democracy rests on the sacred principle that the voice of the people matters. There's no room for firewalls. You either uphold the principle or you don't. Europeans, the people, have a voice. European leaders have a choice. And my strong belief is that we do not need to be afraid of the future. You can embrace what your people tell you, even when it's surprising, even when you don't agree. And if you do so, you can face the future with certainty and with confidence, knowing that the nation stands behind each of you. And that, to me, is the great magic of democracy. It's not in these stone buildings or beautiful hotels. It's not even in the great institutions that we have built together as a shared society. To believe in democracy is to understand that each of our citizens has wisdom and has a voice. And if we refuse to listen to that voice, even our most successful fights will secure very little. As Pope John Paul II, in my view, one of the most extraordinary champions of democracy on this continent or any other, once said, "Do not be afraid." We shouldn't be afraid of our people, even when they express views that disagree with their leadership.
And even though it was a cultural point with severe economic implications for the peoples of Europe and the UK, actually the framework in which he delivered it correctly was one of a democratic deficit. He said that people in Europe had never voted for this unbridled immigration. And he's right. No one in Europe voted for it. No one was given the opportunity to say that they don't want millions of people coming in, that they don't want their borders unenforced, that they don't want to change the demographic composition of their people so dramatically, so quickly. He didn't go on to talk about DEI, but he could equally have gone on and talked about how the people coming in, as I've alluded to earlier, how the people coming in have had a protected blanket put around them and had their interests promoted over and above and to the detriment of the majority of the people in this country. Again, I've touched on this, so I won't bore you with it again. But you see the democratic deficit that he was effectively calling out. And what was Europe's reaction to this? What was the immediate reaction? Well, the immediate reaction was the defense minister of Germany getting up, a guy called Boris Pistorius, and rejecting everything JD Vance said. He essentially said that we believe in the rule of law. We don't believe that the truth of a group of people can be held to be the truth, and that we don't agree that people should be able to speak their minds, saying whatever they wish to say, because it might undermine the rule of law. It might be damaging to the country.
This is why I cannot just ignore what we heard before. I cannot not comment on the speech we heard by the US Vice President. We fight for your right to be against us. That is the motto, one of the mottos of the Bundeswehr, and it stands for our democracy. This democracy that was just called into question by the US Vice President, and not just the German democracy, but Europe as a whole. He spoke of the annulment of democracy, and if I understood him correctly, he compares the condition of Europe with the condition that prevails in some authoritarian regimes. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not acceptable. This is not acceptable. This is not the Europe, not the democracy where I live and where I conduct my election campaign right now. And this is not the democracy that I witness every day in our parliament. In our democracy, every opinion has a voice. And it makes it possible for parties that are partly extremist, such as the AfD, and they can campaign just as any other party. This is democracy. And if the Vice President had the opportunity to switch on his TV set when he arrived yesterday, he would have seen one of those candidates in primetime TV. By the way, we even admit media that spread Russian propaganda, and the representatives of the federal government answer their questions. Nobody is excluded. But democracy does not mean that a vociferous minority will automatically be right, and they cannot decide what truth is. It does not mean that anyone can say anything, and democracy must be able to defend itself against extremists that try to destroy it. I am happy to live in Europe, where this democracy is defended every day against its internal and external enemies. And therefore, I would like to explicitly contradict and oppose the impression that Vice President Vance suggested here, that our democracies oppress and silence minorities. We not only know against whom we defend our countries, but also what we defend it for. It's for democracy, for freedom of opinion, for the rule of law and the dignity of each and every one, ladies and gentlemen.
But he clearly didn't get the point. You should be allowed pretty much to say whatever it is you wish to say. Unless you're inciting violence, you should be allowed to say whatever you wish to say. Any move to shut down offensive speech that might upset minority ethnicities, upset people who make the rules that govern us, particularly the people who govern us, is speech that is absolutely critical. He just didn't get the point. He didn't address the point on migration, the effective, illegitimate migration that Western governments have forced down the people's throat for the last 25 odd years. He didn't address that. He just addressed the democratic deficit and the absence of free speech in Europe. And in my view, the way he addressed it basically proved JD Vance's point. So that gives Europe and the United Kingdom a choice, doesn't it? It gives us a choice. Are we going to stand in opposition, as clearly Boris Pistorius does, to the direction of travel of the United States of America, which in my view is pro-free speech, pro-democracy? Are we going to stand in opposition to that and continue with this dumbing down of our constitutions, our political ecosystems, trashing the interests of the majority, silencing the majority and making them take the knee to whatever is the latest extreme left ideology that our respective governments wish to force down our throats? Are we going to take that line? Or are we in Europe going to wake up and realize actually the right thing to do by our own countries, by our own people, and actually, if we wish to stay allied and at peace with the United States of America, is to react positively to the criticism of JD Vance? I actually think we're going to do the latter. I think we are going to react positively to the criticism, in part because the criticism is valid, in part because if we don't react to it, we're going to find a massive chasm develop between Europe, the United Kingdom on one hand, and the US on the other, and that cannot be in our own interests or in the interest of the people that govern us. And in part, and this is the big point, and in part because I think the people across Europe and the United Kingdom already know what's going on, and they're banging the drum to fix our constitutional and political ecosystems. They, the silent majority, are going to be emboldened by what he said, and they're going to come out and they're going to demand change, just like we have been, people listening to this sympathetic to what I've been saying, just like we have been for at least 9 years, when the majority of the British people decided they want an end to the anti-democratic entity that governed the United Kingdom, which is the European Union. So I take great heart from JD Vance's speech. And the second news item I'd like to talk about is the Russian-Ukrainian war, which made the headlines this week when President Trump said that he wanted a negotiated settlement, and that negotiated settlement may involve some of Ukraine being retained by Russia, some of the parts of Ukraine occupied by Russia being retained by them. He also talked about the presence of a European force in Ukraine. And of course, Europe was up in arms about this as well, because it was essentially saying that America's turning its back on Ukraine, it's turning its back on world peace, it's encouraging Russia by rewarding it, and that Russia may therefore be emboldened to make further attacks on the West and other parts of the globe by our failure to hold Russia in check in Ukraine. But that's the wrong analysis. And I'll tell you why it's the wrong analysis. Our whole approach to Ukraine has been wrong from the start. We've repeatedly said to President Zelensky that you must prosecute this war the way you wish to prosecute it, and we're going to give you pretty much whatever you want, with the exception of putting boots on the ground. And I don't think any sensible politician should be writing a blank check to a foreign power to prosecute a war without their own domestic geopolitical interest being taken into account. The United Kingdom should not be involved in any proxy war where it is not very carefully analysing what is in its own best interest. And I reject completely that what suits Zelensky, what suits Ukraine is automatically in our best interests. I don't agree that a war that could go on for 40 or 50 years between Ukraine and Russia would be in our interest. Actually, I don't even think it would be in Ukraine's interest. And the last time that the West gave a blank check to a fighting force to do that which it needed to do to eject a foreign power was the Mujahideen, who then were absolutely armed to the teeth by us, destabilized. They got rid of Russia in the end. I think Russia couldn't tolerate the continued aggression of the Mujahideen. But the result of that war was a destabilized Pakistan, a more radically Islamized part of the world, the creation through that radical form of Islam of the Taliban, the creation effectively of Al-Qaeda, the Twin Towers, and then everything that happened after the Twin Towers. Again, the invasion of Afghanistan, the bombing of Iraq, the invasion of Iraq. And from that, you can also draw pretty seamlessly a direct causal link to the creation of a failed state in Libya, the war in Libya, the removal of President Mubarak in Egypt, the flirtation Egypt had with itself becoming extreme Islam, run by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an extreme Islamist institution, the failure of Syria, etc., etc., etc. So the ramifications of giving a foreign power a blank check to prosecute a war can be vast. And I've never understood why we were making that mistake in Ukraine. So I completely support President Trump in what he's doing. I would also go further and say Europe is at the heart of this creation of this problem. And there are two or three reasons why I want to say that. There are two or three reasons why I say that. The first is that it was Europe that was encouraging Ukraine to turn its head for monetary and economic support away from Russia towards the European Union. The European Union, I can't remember the exact date, but sometime before the war in Crimea, was offering a package of 10 billion euros and wanting to take Ukraine further towards the EU and into the orbit of the European Union. And NATO was doing the same thing. And that was bound to irritate Russia. I'm not legitimizing Russia's attack. I'm just pointing out that it would have been a red rag to Russia, that its Crimean port, which was important to it, was being threatened by Ukraine's head being turned westward without any real thought of the geopolitical implications for Russia. And I'm not endorsing Russia's war. I'm just saying that's the effect it would have had. And that's why Russia invaded Crimea. But then Germany and France did something much more encouraging of Russia than what President Trump is putting on the table now. They sat on the Ukrainians and said, you've got to cede Crimea to Russia because we want peace in the region. Of course, remember at this time, Germany was busy building Nord Stream, hooked on a diet of Russian oil and gas because it had turned its back on nuclear power after Fukushima, something that Angela Merkel did, who was a deeply damaging chancellor for Germany, in my view. And in that other way, Germany also encouraged Russia because it enriched Russia by buying its oil and gas. Germany, France, Europe are at the heart of this problem. And I therefore endorse again President Trump's view that if a force is required in Ukraine, it should be a European one. And by the way, that would be a much better outcome if Ukrainians are worried about their ongoing protection against Russia than a simple membership of NATO, because having Western European boots on the ground would mean that if Russia were ever to try and increase its territorial hold in Ukraine, it would have to face Western European troops straight away. That would be a European war straight away, which would probably take America in as well. It is a better security blanket for Ukraine, in my view, than joining NATO. Now, all of that is hypothetical, by the way, because all that President Trump has done is bring Ukraine and Russia effectively to the negotiating table by what he said. And for all the reasons I've just been through, it is exactly the right thing to do. And when they're at that negotiating table, what our politicians should be doing is not thinking just about what's in Ukraine's best interest, though they should do that. They should also be thinking unashamedly about what's in our interests. That is what it means to be a democratically governed country, to have a governance system which puts in charge people who look after your interests at every level, domestically, internationally, geopolitically, and even when it comes to the settlement of a war. So two really big things this week, which I take huge encouragement from: the American administration calling Europe out for its democratic deficit. And Europe will, I'm sure, Europe and the United Kingdom will, I'm sure, get its act together as a result of that. It has to. The people here already want it, and we will not be silenced. And then the other thing is bringing, I hope, at least the beginning of the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you very much for listening, folks. Have a very good week.